Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. The Association of Foreign Press Correspondents in the United States, in partnership with the Hinrich Foundation, is hosting the educational program on the Sustainable Trade Index 2025. Dr. Christos Cabolis, Chief Economist at the IMD World Competitiveness Center, will present to us the key findings and discuss its implications for global trade and journalism. This program is developed in partnership with the Hinrich Foundation and the Association of Foreign Press Correspondents in the United States, is solely responsible for the development and content of this program. As I mentioned, the Sustainable Trade Index, STI, developed by the Hinrich Foundation and the IMD World Competitiveness Center, measures the capacity of 30 major global economies to trade sustainably, balancing economic growth, social development, and environmental protection. The 2025 edition examines how countries perform across three main pillars: economic pillar, assessing innovation, trade infrastructure, and competitiveness; societal pillar, evaluating human capital, labor standards, and political stability; environmental pillar, the third, measuring carbon intensity, pollution, and responsible resource use. Through this educational program, international correspondents and journalists will gain a deeper understanding of how the Sustainable Trade Index can serve as a valuable tool for analyzing global trade dynamics. Participants will learn how to interpret the data behind the index, identify key trends shaping sustainable trade policy, and translate these insights into informed reporting on international economic and environmental developments. It is an honor for me to introduce Christos Cabolis, Chief Economist and Head of Operations at the IMD World Competitiveness Center and Adjunct Professor of Economic and Competitiveness at IMD. Formerly at Yale and Alba Graduate Business School, his research has been published in top journals such as the Review of Financial Studies and Journal of Law and Economics, among other publications. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of California, Santa Barbara. Good morning, Professor, and thank you for joining us.
Good morning, Stephanie. Good morning to your audience. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you very much for giving us this opportunity to share with you this extremely exciting ranking that we built in collaboration with the Hinrich Foundation. Let me share my slides.
Sure. Yes, Professor, this is very interesting. The 2025 index underscores the dynamic and often challenging environment in which economies now operate and illustrates how economies recalibrate their trade practices in response to shifting trade conditions, including geopolitical uncertainties and market fragmentation. So there we have this slide. Professor, please let us know a little bit more about those interesting findings.
Indeed. I think you did a fantastic job introducing the topic of the Sustainable Trade Index. Usually the first question is in the minds of people is, what exactly do we mean by sustainable? And we take the word literally. We essentially try to measure how trade can sustain itself over time, how trade can deliver mutual benefits through openness, adaptability, and trust to the economies that participate in the international trade environment. Essentially, what STI was designed to do is to find how economies create the conditions that trade can be endured. And you already mentioned that essentially it's how you manage a very complex set of economic growth, societal well-being, and environmental stewardship. So it evaluates the ability of fair economies to engage in this sustainable trade, and it includes major trading blocks in Asia Pacific. So let me show you geographically the countries that actually are part of the STI, the 30 economies. As you can see, the focus is the Pacific Ocean. And the major trading blocks are the APEC, the SPTPP, and the RCEP. These 30 countries actually share more than 60% of the global GDP, 66% of the global GDP. And they also, basically, their share is more than 60% of the total population. So we're speaking about major economies that for the world international trade. We have 72 criteria with 3 pillars that you very eloquently said before. Economic pillar, which essentially measures the things that we see in the screen. How different economies promote trade? How do they reduce the barriers? How do they diversify the trade partners? The societal pillar assesses how different economies develop their human capital. Very, very important issue. And of course, it deals with issues related to inequality and, very importantly, healthcare, in order to have resilience for the societal, for the labor force, and therefore the societal pillar. And finally, the environmental pillar, which in many ways evaluates how economies manage their natural resources, what exactly do with respect to controlling emissions, and how do they try to prevent pollution. So when we put these 72 criteria together in our methodology, and we try to evaluate the 3 pillars that we have, we basically have the following ranking that you see in your screen. So this basically tries to give what exactly is going on with economic capability of the different economies, with societal performance, and with the environmental stewardship. Interestingly, what we observed this year is that between the different economies that we see there are some wide performance gaps. The score runs from 100 to 0, so this is the total range. But for instance, if you see between Philippines and Vietnam, there is a very big gap. Between Cambodia and Sri Lanka is a very, very big gap. And between Bangladesh and Pakistan is a very big gap. In essence, these gaps are among all the economies. So we see this wide performance gap. And also what we observed is that economies may have identical performance on individual criteria. For instance, how open the economies are. But at the same time, what we see is that they follow completely different strategies. So this actually led us to start thinking that in addition to the Sustainable Trade Index, the STI being a scoreboard that we used in the past, it has to tell us a little bit more about these different strategies that the economies are using despite the similarities that they have. So what is different in 2025? The last 30 years, 35 years, the global trade was based on certain important values: efficiency, globalization, multilateralism. What we see this year, actually the last couple of years, is that this consensus it does not work anymore. It is quite broken. We see that the supply chains are being re-engineered. We see that the trade agreements are becoming more exclusive, And we also see that, as we said before, that there are similar criteria essentially lead in completely different strategies. So how we can go a step further and try to take more information out of this observation? And essentially what we try to do is we structure our interpretation of the results around three trade-offs. The first trade-off basically asks, how much efficiency are we willing to sacrifice as an economy to gain control over critical resources or technologies? This is the efficiency versus strategic autonomy trade-off. There's another trade-off, which is, can countries keep benefiting from open markets without eroding the social trust and equity that make trade politically viable? So in some respect, we have a short-term profitability versus long-term social cohesion that is a major trade-off. And finally, can global environmental goals coexist with national growth aspirations, especially in the developing world? So these are the three trade-offs that we tried to incorporate in our analysis and try to understand what exactly is going on with this year's Sustainable Trade Index. And let me just, for the benefit of our listeners and our audience, speak about the very first one, the resilience versus efficiency. This essentially is how we can go from resilience to realignment of the trade environment. When we speak about resilience, essentially we speak about redundancy. The concept of resilience came to our lives essentially a little bit after COVID, because we realized that countries realized, economies realized that while in the past efficiency was an extremely important factor that we were trying to reach, the in-time delivery, the in-time orders, and therefore no additional costs with respect to having a warehouse and so on and so forth. All of a sudden, with the pandemic, this actually broke down. And then after the pandemic, what we had was the introduction of the geopolitical issues, the tense relationship between United States and China, the invasion of Russia to Ukraine. This essentially resulted in the breakdown of the supply chains. And therefore, economies, producers, started to rethink the concept of efficiency. So if resilience demands some kind of redundancy, then what you would like as a producer is to have multiple suppliers in different parts of the world. So essentially what we try to do is we try to see this specific trade-off. So we thought that we will put autonomy, strategic autonomy, which can be accomplished with the imposition of tariffs. Essentially, the tariffs try to ignite reindustrialization and, very importantly, try to ignite some self-sufficiency of the different economies. So we try, this is a 2x2 matrix, where essentially we categorize economies based on the strategic autonomy, high tariffs, autonomy, low tariffs, efficiency, and liberalization, high liberalization and low liberalization. And what we see is something very, very interesting. We see countries that may belong in a similar evaluation of the different criteria, they choose different ways as strategy in this particular trade-off. So in the dilemma efficiency versus autonomy, we see, for instance, countries that are having very low tariffs, very high liberalization approaches. Basically, they're moving towards the efficiency range, and these are the open market leaders. This is New Zealand. This is Chile and Peru. While we see countries that have high liberalization, but at the same time they impose high tariffs. And these are progressive economies like the US and Australia, but also protected. And by the same token, we see high tariffs and low liberalization. These are countries like India, China, or Bangladesh. And finally, we see countries that are having low tariffs. So in that respect, they're going for efficiency and low liberalization. And these economies like Russia and Sri Lanka are using selective openness, their economy. So this essentially brings the index this year to the real question, which is no who leads the ranking necessarily, even though this is very, very important, but what are we losing and gaining in the transition of going from the consensus that we had to the fragmented world that we see now? And essentially, I would like to leave the audience with this thought that essentially the sustainable trade, the way that we define it, is not a destination, but it is always a process of adaptation. And I will stop here and let me stop sharing. And I thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor. It's very interesting, especially because in the last slide that you showed to us, I could see two of the biggest trade countries in the world, China, US, and India, for example, who are these big actors, showing us how the world is reshaping in terms of trade. And both of them, well, the three of them are in the list of high tariffs. Ones are low liberalization, others are high liberalization. How do you think these three can reshape the rest of the strategy that other countries with a smaller size or depending on other countries for trade are moving?
So this is a very good question. Economies now, I think the ones that will reflect on these issues and will move forward are the ones who will set the goals that they would like to achieve. They will place an objective, what they would like to do. And then they will use the trade-offs, this particular one between autonomy and efficiency, and the other two trade-offs, strategically choosing the best policy that can achieve the final objective, the mission that they have. So how do governments decide, essentially, between autonomy and efficiency? And I would say that there is not a country that can basically rely on complete autonomy. We are an integrated framework. But what you can do is decide how there are the different needs that you would like to protect and the areas that you would like to be more open. So in some respect, this will depend on exposure to geopolitical risk. If we have countries that are very, very much dependent in one good that they produce or in one good that they import. Think about European countries that essentially a major problem with energy became apparent in a very difficult way after the war of Russia and Ukraine. So geopolitical exposure to geopolitical risk is one component. Institutional capacity is another one. That is, how capable an economy is to absorb different shocks and maintain the open markets. And thirdly, which is also very important, is the development stage of the economies. So in the three economies that you mentioned, we have one advanced economy, United States. We have one emerging economy that is moving rapidly towards the advanced area, China. And we have India, who is an emerging economy, but it's not at the point of China yet, right? So they will move, ideally, they will choose different levels in the different trade-offs that we have.
And when it comes about US and China, Professor, do you think they are contributing to increase the gap between countries? And I want to go back to the first slide that you showed to us when we saw how there are some countries who are like dramatically in the other side of the chart, when we compare the index, in terms of how they are competing with other big countries like US and China. Are they in a disadvantage because of that massive production they are having, or the massive trade that they are putting in place right now?
So, not really. What we see regionally is some breakdown based on the development states and the resources that the different countries own. United States and parts of Europe are progressive but protected. What we saw on the upper left hand, and essentially they maintain liberal institutions while they raising tariffs, and they're using industrial policy to de-risk the supply chains. China and India, part of the Asia, essentially, they use a protection pathway. They essentially are very selective in the autonomy that they would like to exhibit. They control the pace of integration to support the industrial upgrading. And then we have the Southeast Asia. Remember, essentially, the countries that we are working on are in Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia, Oceania, and the west coast of the Americas, right? Most of these countries. And over there, we have mixed strategies, which is very, very interesting. For instance, think about Vietnam and Malaysia. They both blend openness with selective controls to attract investments. And they hedging the geopolitical uncertainty. Both of these countries hedge the geopolitical uncertainty that exists with China as the biggest economy. Right?
Professor, you mentioned the word exclusive when it comes about the new trade agreements between countries. And that's very interesting. And it comes to my mind the USMCA that will be renegotiated next year in the US between Canada and Mexico as well. So when you mention exclusive, can you tell us a little bit more about what is pushing countries to be more restrictive or exclusive when they think about establishing a deal that will remain for years and probably setting the rules for a whole region, like, for example, North America?
So what I think about when I mention that supply chains become more exclusive and trade agreements are becoming more exclusive is because the multilateral world, the fact that most countries were seeing the same objectives, the same mission, to be more open, to be more efficient, to be more multilateral. This has broken down. And there are many different reasons, and maybe we're not going to have time to discuss about that, but this came emphatically when we started having the pandemic, where we started fragmenting the world depending on the capacity that the different economies had with respect to medical production, medical services, the ability to provide the services to the citizens of the economy, and so on and so forth, right? And then we had the breakdown of the energy trade. In addition to that, we have in the back of our minds the fossil fuel, which for several years was many countries were trying to find ways to use less and less energy from fossil fuel and more renewable energy, right? So these were the ones that started basically fragmenting the world. And of course, the trade agreements that will allow for economies to be more trusting with each other will be starting with very, very few members.
Professor, which regions are leading the move toward greater autonomy, and what's driving that shift?
So the move towards the autonomy is mainly from United States and Europe, right? China, United States and Europe. China always had a protective environment, which started becoming even more protective now. But essentially, the US and Europe lead because of security and technological issues. So these are the strategic priorities, and these are the players who become more thoughtful about how to move forward. China and India also push for autonomy, but their drivers are industrial upgrading. So it's slightly different than United States and the West. And Southeast Asia follows most of the times a hybrid model. And the hybrid model is remaining open, but hedging the risks. In general, what we see compared with a few years back is that autonomy, strategic autonomy, is increasing in its presence around the world.
Professor, and while we go to the next question, there is an attendee who is asking to return to the slides so they can see how are the countries positioned in this index. And one of the questions that I have is, do you think that we are seeing evidence that building more autonomy actually makes countries safer or just becoming more expensive?
I'm sorry, say that again?
Yeah, do you think that we are seeing evidence that building more autonomy actually makes countries safer or just more expensive?
So both, actually. More autonomy increases resilience. And in that respect, I think is what you mean by being more safe. You have a higher capacity to address different adversities that come your way. But of course, if the autonomy increases beyond a particular point, then what you start having is that the supply chains are becoming much more fragmented. Essentially, the goods are going to be much more expensive, and innovation may be affected as well.
And how do governments decide how much economic autonomy they need without hurting their own growth?
So based essentially on their exposure, on the geopolitical risk, on the institutional capacity that they have, which is extremely important, and also on the development stage of the economy, how advanced or not it is. Obviously, the more advanced it is, they may try to find ways through technology to basically substitute some of the imports. But this can happen up to a certain degree. If we have an economy which is emerging and great need to develop more, then they will be in a more difficult position to move forward.
And Professor, when we talk about the short-term profitability versus the long-term social cohesion, which countries are handling this balance well, growing economically in one side, while still protecting workers and communities, which is probably one of the main concerns looking forward the future of trade and policy in this aspect for countries?
Yes, shall I share a slide that I have about that? So here we are addressing the issue that you are discussing, the short-term profitability with a long-term social cohesion. Essentially, what we have here is economies that are deciding what the goal will be. And the goal is a short-term versus long-term. Social cohesion is a long-term a long-term attempt to reach, and it's very, very difficult to establish. While high profitability, sometimes different economies may think that it's a very, very important issue, and they can capture it as fast as possible. So your question was, Stephanie, how we are coming up on this issue? How does we see the connection between the trade policies and essentially we see it through different ways. Rising inequality is one of them. This can be an income inequality. Labor standards may be eroding, and social mobility may be decreasing. And there may be issues, especially in some economies, of forced labor engagement. So these essentially are issues that erode the trust of the society in the benefits that the society can get from trade. And once this is eroded, then it's very, very difficult to reverse it.
And Professor, how can governments avoid the mistake of focusing only on fast economic gains at the cost of the long-term social stability?
It's a very difficult problem and a very difficult dilemma for governments, essentially because the social cohesion, in order to be established and maintained, because it has to be maintained, there must be investment in education, in healthcare, in labor standards, and in mobility. And in order to provide that, you need the appropriate infrastructure for institutions and to be able to basically maintain these aspects for a long period of time. This is how a government is avoiding a mistake to focusing only in one thing of the two, and most importantly, in the profits. Trade legitimacy, and this is a very big issue. It's a very big issue even in economies like big economies, United States. Trade legitimacy is not automatic. It has to be established, it has to be visible, and essentially it has to give an answer to the question, who in the end gains from these trade relationships? Because if there are parts of the society that do not see their lives becoming better, of course they will become bitter, and they are not going to believe that trade actually helps them.
And in this matter, Professor, from the data, What are some early warning signs that countries' trade strategy is creating social tension?
So, um, rising economic inequality, the Gini coefficient for those who follow these things, stagnant social mobility. When we see that essentially from one generation to the next generation, or even members of the same generation, do not see any mobility, growing forced labor, uh, or informality in the labor relations. These are weak enforcement of labor standards. Uneven economic development within the country. These are early signs. And of course, all these are augmented if we have declining political stability. These are some signals that we have to take into consideration what exactly is going on. These are the struggling economies right now.
And in the other side, from the data, what social investments seem to give the strongest long-term payoff?
It's true, but sometimes let's not forget that it is not necessarily that some countries do not know that they have to do that. But the undertaking of these investments, think about investment in education, for instance, is something that is taking place now, and the results of this investment come up a little bit later, many years later, right? So it needs patience and it needs focus, awareness from many stakeholders within an economy.
And Professor, another of the pillars that you were mentioning were climate ambition versus development. Why do some developing countries see new climate rules from richer countries as green protectionism? And the US is also another example, right, about how our policies shifting when it comes about climate rules or climate protection or policies in that regard.
So this is a very big issue, and it's a topic of tremendous interest in many parts of the academic world, but also of practitioners. So what exactly is the trade-off that we have here? The trade-off essentially is whether economies that are in the trade-off is between climate ambition and development sovereignty. So these two issues must align. And the main question is, are the climate ambition of a particular economy in line with its development states? In other words, can a particular economy assume higher cost of addressing certain environmental goals the same time that they would like to develop and advance their economy um, um, to go beyond the point that they are now, I mean, decrease the poverty level of the economy, for instance. And the answer is not easy, and it is not binary. It's not you do this or that. In fact, in all our trade-offs, as you saw, the answer is not either or. It really depends on different characteristics of the economy. So this is the issue that we have here. And what we see, surprisingly, is that again, you see that economies that may have similar measures, evaluations of criteria like high renewables or low renewables, they may have high economic footprint or low economic footprint. That is, you really emit or pollute very little, and this does not come randomly. It comes out of a sophisticated and aligned approach by stakeholders within the economy. And what we see is that we have high ecological footprint and high renewables, countries like New Zealand and Chile. And at the same time, you have low ecological footprint and high renewables, and these are the sustainable starters. So they are starting their journey to sustainability, but they're in the early stage. They have a tremendous benefit because they have high renewables, and they should start taking advantage of that. And will they be able to? Well, this is an issue to be discussed, but essentially you see countries like Laos, Cambodia, Pakistan, Papua New Guinea. So it's very promising. These are environmentally sustainable, low emissions, and they have to try, going back to the discussion that we have, to avoid replicating the fossil fuel growth path.
And how can advanced economies push for strong climate action without blocking the development paths of poorer countries? And I can see, for example, Ecuador in the chart that it's undervalued its potential.
So it needs realignment by many different actors. The green transition must be aligned with the development goals. The policies should build capabilities, not impose burdens. And these are also from advanced economies, the ones that are sustainable at the frontier. They have very, very good presence in the in the environmental pillar. But essentially, you cannot accept a path that you will impose burden to the developing countries while you have surpassed this path and you have emitted in the past, and now you realize that this is not a good idea and you try to use a different development journey.
And Professor, what parts of the Sustainability Trade Index help us understand which economies are leading on climate-friendly trade and which are struggling? Is this side that you are showing us right now in this slide?
So yes, so New Zealand and Chile are doing a high green industrial transition. They try to transit. They have high renewables, and they have high ecological footprint. So their challenge is to align how the resources used should be adapted, the land use and so on and so forth. And then you have countries that have high impact economies, countries that have low renewables but have high ecological footprint, like Japan, like Malaysia, like United States. And they have in this particular category, and it's not going to be a surprise for you, we have high ecological pressure, but at the same time, you have low levels of renewables, which means that why you are technologically advanced, United States, but they lag in the transition of their energy systems. And this is how they need to, this is how what needs to be addressed.
Yeah. And Professor, there's another aspect very interesting from this index is the impact of tariffs on sustainable trade. How are rising tariffs, especially between major economies, changing the way countries think about sustainable trade?
So obviously, this is a very good, a very timely question. The very big issue is that tariffs essentially introduce taxation for the local economy. and therefore they may affect negatively the path to sustainability, and this is one of the big issues now. Unless if the taxation goes towards goods that are highly polluted, which again, this is something that we have seen from Europe, for instance, that when they are imposing the cross-border adjustment for the emissions, right? I mean, these are issues that result in higher price of brown products. And this, in some respect, the hope is, will align the industries to start using technology and produce have a greener process to produce their products.
And do you think that the tariffs are slowing progress or pushing countries to look for new partners and new models?
I'm sorry, can you repeat?
Yeah, sure. Do you think that tariffs are slowing progress or pushing countries to look for new partners and new models?
Absolutely. This is absolutely correct. And this is one of the reasons we have what we discussed before about exclusive trade agreements. What we see is agreements that become the topic of fewer members, fewer countries that align among them on what they try to accomplish, what they try to have as a free, non-tariff barriers, and so on and so forth.
And Professor, China is a big player in this whole scenario we have worldwide. And China continues to expand its influence through trade investment and infrastructure projects. Can you tell us a little bit more about this expanding role that China is taking right now?
So absolutely. So China essentially sees a void in terms of leadership in the global trade network. We had United States that had the leadership role for many decades. And now United States takes a step back and says, actually, I'm not particularly willing to continue playing this role. And China finds a place and enters that, starting having critical strategic agreements with Africa, with Canada, with the European Union. Of course, these are not straightforward because there are a number of issues, as we were discussing before, related to safety and related to technology. And who will control the aspects of technology that are assumed crucial for own safety. But nevertheless, yes, China is moving towards that direction.
And what about the growing footprint, Professor? China's growing footprint, and what does that mean for other economies trying to balance openness, competitiveness, and autonomy?
So this really will depend on the resourcefulness of the economies and on the potential geopolitical risk. So the fact that United States and China started having very tense relations was a benefit for Vietnam because a lot of the goods traded from China were going through Vietnam. So all of a sudden, Vietnam saw an increase. Malaysia also found the same way. And this was really because of the change of the geopolitical map. So your question is very timely, and essentially many economies try to set the pace that they feel will benefit them. You have India, for instance, that tries very hard not to take any side, And therefore, this has a particular cost, but nevertheless, they're moving towards that direction, and they try to keep distance from both parties. You have Europe or Canada that see the relationship with United States being at a less important point compared to what it used to be, and they try to find new partners in order to trade their goods.
And my last question, Professor, do you see in an optimistic way the shape that trade in the world is now changing or evolving? Because you mentioned that sustainability is a process, right? So is it optimistic what you are seeing, what you forecast?
I would say that every period of I will say something that everybody says, so it's not going to be surprising, right? Every period of every crisis results in some costs, tremendous costs sometimes, but through these costs, there are opportunities to move forward. And what I would like to see here is that across the trade-offs that we have in our rankings, we see the opportunity for the countries to start having a much clearer picture of what they would like to do. And if the mission, the vision is clear, how they can possibly achieve it faster. And in that way, I think that we are moving into a position that may be more promising for the future. I will say also that the fact that maybe we are not big believers of the multilateral agreements nowadays, because everybody feels that multilateral agreements are zero-sum games, and basically everybody else benefits and they don't. These kind of smaller, more exclusive trade agreements may be the way to start building trust again. Because trade, as many other things, a particular component for its success is that we trust the process, we trust the partners, the trading partners, and we trust that the results are the ones that we think will benefit the biggest part of the population that you have. So if a way to build this trust again is to start anew with smaller trade agreements, then yes, I think that that's positive and may contribute greatly in the future.
We will definitely need to keep an eye on that, Professor, because the economic policies around the world are changing very rapidly, especially nowadays when everything is moving faster. So definitely these data that we can see in this index will be very useful for journalism to report accurately what is going on right now in this moment. Probably that will change in the future, but right now this is a very interesting assessment, Professor. So I appreciate this time, your explanation, and of course, your comments on every single aspect of this index and its findings.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. It was very, very nice to have this conversation with you. Appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. And just to remind to everybody, the Sustainable Trade Index developed by the Hinrich Foundation and the IMD World Competitiveness Center measures the capacity of 30 major global economies to trade sustainability, balancing economic growth, social development, and environmental protection. And this program is developed in partnership with the Hinrich Foundation and the Association of Foreign Press Correspondents in the United States, and is solely responsible for the development and content of this program. Thank you so much, and see you soon.